As Joshua noted in his prayer today, we will start looking at another. Good evening. Hey, Bluth. Good to see you. Hello.
Yes, good evening.
Everything well? Doing well?
Yes.
All right, that's great. Well, thank you everybody for for making time tonight. As Joshua said, we're going to be starting our next module. We're going to focus our attention on biblical narrative. So we called it the exegesis and exposition of biblical narrative or stories. A majority of the Bible is in the form of stories. So we want to be able to understand how do we study those and how do we preach them? Because there are some differences that we want to consider as we do that. Differences compared to epistles or even poems or prophetic texts as well. So the focus here in the next several months is going to be on biblical narratives. But before we talk about that, it's important to understand, what is the narrative genre? When we talk about narratives, what are we saying? And even just before that, answering the question of genre, particularly genre in literature, genre in the Bible. And that word genre comes from it's a French word, and it has the idea of a kind or a type. Now, when we think of genres or kinds or types of literature, what comes to your guys' mind? What comes to your mind? What are different genres that we find in literature, written genres? What are the different kinds of literature that we have in the world? Anybody want to offer some answers to that? What are the kinds of genre?
Is that poetry?
Okay, good. Poetry.
And so is how about prophetic?
Okay, yeah. When we're talking about the Bible, prophecy, how about just literature in general, just books in our culture and society, or other forms of written literature? We have like letters, right? People write letters. What are some other things?
Legal document.
Yeah, legal documents, like contracts or court documents or laws, right? That's a form of genre, a kind of literature. Anything else?
Corner.
What's that, Fue? Looks like he froze up there. What are some others? There's lots of them.
News.
Yeah, news articles, sports articles in newspapers, comic books, right? Textbooks, right? You can have physics or psychology or math, right? Those are forms of kinds of writings. Anything else come to mind?
Fiction.
Yeah, fiction, novels, short stories. How about plays, right? Movie scripts. Even texting, we could call that a written, right? I mean, there are actually a lot of different kinds of literature or genres, different ways that people have expressed thoughts or ideas. History is another one. Even with letters, there are different kinds of letters. We mentioned letters earlier, but you can have letters that are love letters, letters that are formal types of letters. You can have informational letters. right? There's even within these, there's different ways. Now, why does this matter? Why are we talking about this? What is the importance of considering different kinds of literature? Well, the importance of it is that in literature, there are different ways to say something. There are different approaches to communicate information. Okay, how you would do that would be different if you were communicating information in the form of a love letter versus a textbook. Would you expect those to be written differently? Would you expect a poem to be written differently than, say, a history book? Right? So we do. There are different rules or different ways that people express their thoughts depending on the kind of genre that they do that in. And this is true in scripture as well. As we think about the Bible, what are some different kinds of genre in the Bible? All right. Pastor Philip mentioned a couple of there's poetry and there's prophecy in the Bible. What are some other genres or types of literature in the Bible? Anybody? Any others come to mind? What's the one we just covered together in the last module?
Epistles.
Yep, epistles or letters. What else?
Apocalyptics.
Okay, yeah, there's a type of prophetic, I'll just put it with prophecy here,
Or
called
prophecy.
apocalyptic literature. It's a form of prophetic literature. Any others come to mind? Do we have history in the Bible?
Law. Yes, law.
Yeah, history, law,
History.
good. We have short stories, right, in the form of parables. That's a specific type of literature we have in the Bible, of course, and then the narratives, as we're going to be talking about. And it really, if we look at the Bible, there are, I think somebody identified, I can't remember, 15 different types of genres in the Bible. I really looked at it. There's really, in my mind, sort of 4 primary types: the epistles, poetry, prophecy, and narrative. All right. Now there are, different kinds of narrative. We have historical, we have parable, we have law, but really, I think there are 4 general categories. Or in prophecy, as Pastor Philip mentioned, there's apocalyptic, which is a form of prophetic literature. There's salvation oracles. There's judgment oracles. All right, so there are some subtypes within these, but really, I think there's, I would say, 4 general categories that we're going to focus on, and that are these 4: epistles, poetry, prophecy, and narrative. And again, the reason it's important to think about these and to actually consider them separately is that genres, or as I said, people communicate ideas and thoughts in different ways, and we need to understand the way they're communicating that thought, because that will affect how we identify that thought, how we uncover it. Again, remember, we talk about exegesis is to draw out the meaning, the author's intended meaning from the text. Well, that will need to include, how did the author express his idea? All right, if he wrote it in the form of a poem, we would need to consider other factors compared to if he had written it as an epistle. For example, let's take the particular doctrine of God's sovereignty. It's taught all through the Bible that God is in control, that he's all powerful, that he's in control of all things. Now, there are different ways that that truth could be expressed. There are different genres in which it is expressed. So, for example, we have in the epistles, Ephesians 1:11. Let me ask Fu Wei, could you read this passage, Ephesians 1:11?
Okay. Also, we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to his purpose, who works all things after the counsel of his will.
Okay, thank you. Short verse, but in the clause that I've highlighted, notice it says, who works all things after the counsel of his will. This is a straightforward statement of God's sovereignty, that God does everything that he wants according to his will. Get it? And we would expect that this is from an epistle, right? The letter to the Ephesians. And we know epistles, that genre is direct instruction. Okay. And so here, Paul just directly states that God works all things after the counsel of his will, that he is sovereign. Now, we could also find the same truth of God's sovereignty depicted in the form of a story. One of the most well-known stories of God's sovereignty, of his control, is from the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph, from Genesis 37 to 50. Here, Zhao Li, could you read for us this one verse at the end of that story?
Sure.
Good evening, by the way.
Good evening. Thank you. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to prevent many people alive.
Okay. So here, I didn't have us read the whole story of Genesis 37 to 50. That would take up our entire class, but I'm sure you guys are familiar with that story of Joseph and being sold into slavery by his brothers, and then being falsely accused of rape and being thrown into prison. And then he has God gives him understanding to interpret dreams. And so he interprets Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh puts him as the second in command over all of Egypt. And as a result, his family is able to be brought to Egypt and live there throughout this great famine. Well, if you read that whole story, there's a lot of interesting parts to that story, but there is an overall purpose to that account. And it is, Joseph mentions it here. He's speaking, just as Joseph speaking, if we remember, Joseph speaking to his brothers after their father, Jacob, had died. And the brothers are thinking, Joseph, now that our father has died, Joseph is going to take revenge on us for what we did to him. And then this is Joseph's answer to them. And he tells his brothers, yes, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good to bring about this present result. That is to save our lives, to save your lives, brothers, he said. And so here we're given the point of the story, that Genesis 37 to 50, those 14 chapters were given in order to communicate basically the same truth that Paul did, just in one short sentence. But here, Moses, who wrote the story in Genesis, wanted to communicate this idea of God's sovereignty in the form of a story, and specifically God's sovereignty to keep his promise to Abraham. And part of that promise would be was to give Abraham many descendants. Well, this famine would have killed all of Abraham's descendants. And so this story was given to us in order to show us how God's sovereign hand worked in the life of Jacob's family to protect their lives. And so here the author Moses reveals that through what Joseph had to say. So instead of giving the truth directly, you know, God is sovereign and his sovereignty protected the lives of Abraham's family so that God could keep his promise. Moses expresses that truth in describing these events that took place in Joseph's life, right? So we have the same doctrinal truth regarding God's sovereignty expressed in two different ways here. One is directly from an epistle. The second is through a story. We could also have it expressed in the form of a poem. And that's exactly what we see here in Psalm 135. Let me do this. I'll ask if Kaptuk, would you be willing to read these verses from Psalm 135?
Yes.
Thank you.
Psalm 135, verse 6 to 7. Whatever the Lord please, he does, in heaven and in earth, in the seas and in all deeps. He caused vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth, who makes lightning for the rain, who bring forth the way from his treasuries.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So here, again, basically, we are given the same doctrinal truth regarding God's sovereignty, right? Whatever the Lord pleases, he does. Okay, that's a statement of his sovereignty. He can do what he wants. But in a poem, notice it's expressed in a different way. He describes specifically the Lord pleases what he does, what he pleases in the heavens, in the earth, in the seas, in the deep. He gives an example: who makes lightnings for the rain, who brings forth the wind. He's going into he's presenting images, illustrations of God's sovereignty, and he does it in a poetic fashion. In fact, notice he uses the word his treasuries. Well, what does that mean? Normally, we think of a treasury as a place where you store valuable things. Well, here that word is used in a poetic sense, a figurative sense, as God has the winds stored up in a secure place and then sends them out. Well, that's a poetic expression in order to convey how God is in control. So in a poem, we're going to see figurative language, we're going to see imagery, we're going to see the truth expressed in order to bring emotion. We'll see repetition. And so, again, it's the same doctrinal truth in all three of these passages, all three of these genres. In Ephesians 1, in an epistle, in Genesis 50, in the story, and then here in Psalm 135 in the form of a poem. They're all giving us essentially the same doctrinal truth, but they're presenting that truth in a different way. And so we need to understand. So for epistles, our focus was a lot on grammatical structure, right? Why is that? Well, because epistles are given in a instructional form. Okay, they're given in a logical flow of thought. They're expressed in paragraphs, and in those paragraphs we have sentences. In those sentences we have phrases and clauses which are connected together in order to communicate those truths. But in a story, we don't approach it in the same way. We don't block diagram a whole story. You're saying, praise God, we don't have to do block diagramming for narratives. Well, we'll do a little bit, but narratives expresses information and the author's thoughts in a different way. He does so in the form of scenes within a story. All right, and so we have to approach, to interpret a story, we have to understand how the stories work. What is the form of a story? How do we analyze a story in order to understand what the author is saying? There's some different things we do. We don't just diagram the story. We have to consider what are the key characteristics of a story, and how does a person, how does an author communicate his point in the form of a story? It's the same when we approach poetry. We have to consider there are other things that a person does when they write a poem. They use other features in order to communicate their point. And we have to understand those. So for example, figurative language, imagery, there's structure, a thing called parallelism that Hebrew poetry uses in order to communicate biblical truth. And so we need to understand those other things, because those are the things that will help us to identify the author's intended meaning. We do the same thing when we communicate. If we are telling a joke, that's another form, by the way, another genre, jokes. You're going to interpret that joke differently than you would if I was teaching, you know, a physics class. And so that's something we have different rules of interpretation depending upon the kind of genre or the way in which a particular thought is being expressed. And so again, there are some rules that are the same, all right? For example, vocabulary, or even grammar to an extent, you know, but there are other, each genre has its own additional set of interpretation rules or hermeneutics in order to understand that genre. So when I tell a joke, say, you're going to interpret that a little differently than if I were reading a poem. Okay, so for example, let's take there's a simple poem that people often use here in the States. You know, roses are red. Whoops. Violets are blue. Whenever I am with you, or let's see, what's that? See, I can't even come up with that. Roses are violets are blue. Everything around me says I love you, right? So this is a little love poem, okay? Now, in Western poetry, rhyme is also a feature. So we have, you know, roses are red, violets are blue, everything around me says I love you. So blue and you, those rhyme. Now, for a poem, we allow for words to be stretched, all right? Notice the statement, violets are blue. Well, no, violets are violet. It's not a blue color. It's a form of blue, but really violet is more like purple. So if I was teaching a physics class and I said violets are blue, then people would say, no, that's false. Violets are not blue. But I'm not giving you a physics lesson. We're not talking about colors here. I'm giving you as a poem. And so I'm going to use words a little differently. And people listening to the poem would understand that. They'd say, oh, he's being figurative here, or he's expressing a poem. And so the way you would interpret blue would be a little bit different. Or for example, there's passages in the Bible that says God will hide you in the shadow of his wings. All right, now we should say, well, wait a minute, that's heresy. That's saying God has wings. That's not true. Does God have wings? This psalm, I can't remember, Psalm 1, it's in a few psalms, Psalm 72, I forget. You'll find it though. It describes God having wings or claws. And you could say, if this was if you're just interpreting it literally, you would say, no, that's false. That's wrong. That contradicts other passages. But knowing that this is in the form of a poem, we allow for the use of figurative language. Here, the poet is expressing God's protection And he does it by describing this picture as if God were like a bird hiding us under his wings, like a bird hides their chicks, their little birds. All right, he's not saying this literally. And we know that because it's a poem. So just by understanding the form of the literature, the genre, that helps us to, when we interpret the passage. All right, and in a poem, we're going to allow for the use of figurative language in order to express an idea or an image. And so here, the poet is not proclaiming that God has wings, but he's describing God in a sort of picture of a bird. And that picture is the truth that he is communicating, that God is our protector. And he could have just said that, right? He could have just said, God protects us. Okay, that's the biblical truth he's communicating, but he chooses to express that truth by giving it in the form of a picture of a bird. All right, or didn't Jesus, when he talked about, he was longing to gather the people like chicks, when he was expressing his lament over Jerusalem. Well, he wasn't saying the people were chicks, but he was giving a picture or an image to express the emotion of what he was saying. All right. All right, any questions on this so far? Does this make sense, that what I'm trying to express here, that depending on how an author writes something, that will affect how we approach interpreting it? That's really the point I'm trying to make. Any questions on that? And again, we do this in everyday life. When you pick up a newspaper, you read that a little differently than you would if you picked up a personal letter from a friend. And you would read that a little differently than, say, a story, a fictional story that you're reading from a book. Or you would even use a different approach if you were studying, a textbook on math. Okay, each of those types of writings brings with it an understood set of hermeneutics, rules of interpretation. And some of those rules will be a little different depending on the kind of communication or literature that you have. All right, sermons, those are another form of communication that you will, when you sit and listen to a sermon, you are, the way you would interpret what is being said, it will be a little different than if you were watching, a love story, a movie that was a love story. Okay. So this is all to tell us that, okay, when we approach different genres in scripture, we have to ask, okay, what is it? How do I approach this genre? What are some rules of interpretation, hermeneutics, for this particular kind of writing in the Bible? All right, and we spent the first module focusing attention mostly on epistles. How do we approach studying an epistle? Now, there will be many steps that are the same when we talk about studying a narrative, but there are some additional steps we need to consider when we look at a narrative, a story. All right, we don't just study a story exactly like we studied an epistle. There are some additional features of a story we need to understand. Now, there are some hermeneutics that apply to every genre, that the Bible's inerrant. All right, there's no error in any of, whether it's a poem or a story or an epistle. And that's why in a poem, when it says God will hide us under the shadow of his wings, we know that, okay, the Bible's inerrant. So therefore, I know that he's not saying literal wings, that God has wings that he flaps. So I know this is not, because other passages tell us God does not have a physical form. So I know the Bible won't contradict itself. So I must need to understand what the author is saying about wings, that there's something different there. Okay, so inerrancy applies to every book of the Bible, every genre. So does authorial intent. Every book, the author, every passage, the author has an intended meaning. So that's true for every genre. Every genre will use words. All right, we need to understand the meaning of those words. Every genre will have a flow of thought, again, connected to the author's intent, whether it's a poem or a story or an epistle or a sermon. There's a flow of thought in that passage, that there are points that the author is connecting. In an epistle, each point is expressed in a paragraph. In a poem, each point is expressed in what we call a stanza, a group of verses that express a particular thought or idea that go together. In a story, the author's flow of thought is expressed in scenes. Now, we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And so this idea of a flow of thought is also consistent among the different genres in the Bible. But there are some additional or specific rules specific to each of those genres as well that we need to consider. And so this module is going to focus on narratives and what we need to understand to interpret and also preach a narrative. We should think about, when you preach a story, you should consider to preach it differently than you would an epistle. And I want to talk about that. What would be the best way to preach a story versus preaching an epistle? Okay. So there also too is not just in how we interpret a story, there'll be some things we need to learn, but also how do you preach that story? All right. So that's going to be also included here in as we go through this together in module 2 on narratives. All right. So the focus of this module will be to learn how to study and preach from the narrative genre. Now, to dive into narratives, I wanted to talk about some basic aspects of narratives or stories that we should consider, think about, understand before we approach studying them. But before we get to those, again, just want to pause a moment. And are there any questions or additional thoughts? Joshua, did anything come to your mind from what we've been talking about that you would like
Sure.
to add or clarify?
Yeah, I think it is a very important understanding of how scriptures are written. Yeah, the rules of interpretation based on the type of genre. Yeah, it just brought to mind during my seminary days. We were talking about First and Second Corinthians as well. That Paul used sarcasm, and they were not meant to be read or not meant to be understood or interpreted as literal, like what Paul was doing. He was using sarcasm to rebuke the Corinthians. For example, like 1 Corinthians chapter 4, I think verse 8, where Paul uses sarcasm, like, in a way like praising the Corinthians. You are already rich. You already reign as king. Those praises were not meant to be understood or interpreted as literal, that the Corinthians were doing so well. In fact, they were not doing well at all. That is Paul's sarcasm to rebuke them for their waywardness. So I mean, this just brought back to mind the importance of understanding how God revealed His scripture in different different genre, different types.
Yeah, what passage was that again, Joshua? I'll pull it up for you. First
Oh yeah,
Corinthians.
that's 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Chapter 4. Yeah, I think verse 8. Yeah, actually, in many places in First Corinthians, I think also in Second Corinthians, Paul uses this kind of language, sarcasm or irony, or irony.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was not meant to be interpreted as literal. It was actually, uh, to some are for rebuke, some are actually for heaping, like strong emulation on the Corinthians. Yeah, this is one example. Yeah.
yeah. You become kings without us. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point that you bring up, is that even within a genre, here an epistle, right, which is direct, it's instructional, even within that there will be other types of writing, sarcasm in this case, and you need to be able to see that. Otherwise you'd say, is he saying this literally? You've become rich, you become kings, you're already filled. Did Paul mean that literally? Well, in the context, that would be strange, because he's not commending them here. He's not praising them. He's actually rebuking them. So because we know that from the context, then we know verse 8, he's actually using that sarcasm as Joshua indicated. Another example comes to my mind actually from 1 Kings, what is it? Says it 17? 18. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel and the prophets of Baal? Remember that story? And how God or how he tells them, right, to make an altar, put the sacrifice on it, and cry out to your God, cry out to Baal, and if he answers you, then he's God, and then I'll make an altar and cry out to Yahweh, and if he answers, then Yahweh is God. And so remember the prophets, they're crying out, right? Oh, Baal, answer us, but there was no voice, no one answered. They leaped around the altar, they were cutting themselves. And then Elijah says, call out with a loud voice. Maybe he's occupied. That means using the bathroom. Or maybe he's asleep. So here, Elijah wasn't speaking literally. He was making fun of them. He was mocking them, or as Joshua mentioned, sarcasm. So he uses that here. So this is right in the middle of a dialogue, of a story. Or another example, John 10, when Jesus is talking about himself as the good shepherd, right? The shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And then he mentions within this, notice he says, I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved. He will go in and out. Well, was Jesus describing himself is he a door? Jesus saying, I'm a door? No, he was presenting a figure of speech, a picture, to describe something about himself that's like a door. Okay, so again, this just reminds us that we have to consider there are different ways that people express a point, and sometimes they'll mix. In a story, you may have someone bring in a figure of speech, or like Joshua mentioned 1 Corinthians 4, in a letter, which is instructional, Paul uses sarcasm, uses a figurative language, really, in order to express a point. All right, good. Any other thoughts that come to your mind, guys, as we think about interpreting different types of literature, particularly in the Bible, but really this would apply to any form of communication? Anyone else have any thoughts or about that? And like I said, this is the case for any communication, whether written or spoken. You know, when somebody talks and the tone of his voice may indicate that he's, you know, like if someone was being sarcastic, you know, we might identify that in how he expresses something. You're so smart, you know. You know, the way I said that would tell you that you all smiled because you knew I wasn't saying it literally. You guys are smart though, but you know, as an example, if I'm talking to someone else, right, the way we express a point, even verbally, there are different ways that, and so you would interpret it differently. When you hear that different tone, you think, he's joking here. And so even in speech, there are different genres, so to speak, of ways that we communicate things. So we are constantly changing or identifying the way something is spoken or something is written. We are taking note of how it's being expressed, because that will guide us in interpreting it. Okay. And so, yeah, if I'm telling a joke, or if I'm being sarcastic, or if I'm speaking directly, if I'm preaching a sermon, you know, sermon is you know, an instructional. Okay, so there's a way that things are expressed, but within that sermon, there will be stories. There may be the use of figures of speech. Some sermons, preachers will communicate a poem or a song. And so we're constantly, what's the right word? Changing or switching the way we're understanding things, depending on the genre or the form in which the words are being spoken or written. And then in verbal communication, even the facial expressions and the tone of voice, the body language also is part of that, how we interpret. So I don't mean to belabor or just repeat myself a lot of times, but this is a very important principle we need to understand regarding the hermeneutics, or the rules of interpretation, when it comes to the different genres. So when we talk about narratives, there are a few features of narratives I want to focus our attention on, because it affects how these affect how we interpret narratives. Or that, again, we're talking about hermeneutics here, the rules of interpretation. And if you'll remember, we have to use good hermeneutics to come up with good exegesis, and good exegesis is necessary for good exposition, or accurate exposition. So the first aspect or element of narratives that we need to consider is narratives are made up of, they're stories, right? And so they're made up of characters, scenes, there's a setting, there's a plot. All of those things come together to give us the exegetical idea. You remember, that's the author's main point, is what, why, how. Okay, we'll break down the stories and interpret them to find the author's what, why, and how. Just like we did for epistles, there's an author's main point, there's a point that he's making, there's a reason for that point, and there's a structure to that point. It's the same with stories. There's a point the author's expressing in the form of a story, there's a reason for that point that he's giving in that story, and there's a structure to the story. The structure is in the form of scenes. All right, now those together, the characters, the setting, the scenes, they together form the plot, or the main flow of the story. And knowing that plot then is what allows us to understand the author's intended meaning. Some describe that as the moral of the story. What's the point of this story? Well, that's the exegetical idea. And that exegetical idea is uncovered by understanding the plot of a story. The plot of a story is identified by noting and understanding the characters, the setting, the scenes within the story. Okay? Thoughts or questions on that? We're going to be spending a lot of time talking about these elements: characters, settings, scenes, plot. Those are the new features as we approach narratives. Those are the new things that we need to consider and think about in order to correctly interpret a narrative. All right. So that's the first thing. Narratives include these elements, and those elements, character, setting, scene, guide us to understanding the plot. That is the sort of the flow of the story, and in understanding the plot, that's what gives us the author's intended meaning, exegetical idea. Now, a second aspect of narratives that we need to consider is that narratives talk about events, things that have taken place, in or either fictional or true. And in Bible, the narratives are true, except when we talk about parables, that's a form of narrative that isn't describing an actual historical event, but it's describing a situation, telling a story in order to convey a particular truth. But narratives tell the story of events that have taken place in order to give a meaning for those who read it. That meaning is conveyed. Authors choose what the characters will say. Authors input, give information about, that called the narrator, who gives information about maybe something the characters are thinking or some event or situation for the story. All right. And is through all of those things, what the characters say, what the characters do, what the narrator communicates, through all of those things, we're able to understand the plot of the story, which then directs us to the particular theological truth that the author wants to communicate through the story. That's what is important and unique about biblical narrative, is that each story is intended to convey theological truth, biblical truth, doctrine. As I showed you before, when we talked about that example of God's sovereignty, that you can express that doctrine either directly in the form of an epistle, you can express that doctrine indirectly in the form of a story. Okay? And a story is meant to convey biblical truth, but it does so in a less direct fashion, usually. That there's a point to the story, and many times the author won't tell us directly what that point is. In Genesis, we were told through what Joseph said. Moses revealed the point of the story was God's sovereign hand in the life of the family of Abraham in order to keep his promise to Abraham. But even that part of it's not fully expressed in what Joseph said. Joseph just said, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good, to preserve many lives. Well, he didn't mention Abraham or the Abrahamic covenant there at all, but we know in the context of Genesis why that God's sovereign hand in their life was important, was because he needed to keep his promise to Abraham. So if Abraham's descendants all died in the famine, then God wouldn't have kept his promise. So often in stories, the author will not tell us directly the point of his story. We have to figure it out by understanding how the author used characters and dialogue, action and scenes and setting, events, all together to present a particular theological truth. Okay, Bible stories were not given just to entertain us. They weren't given just to express some history, things that happened. Biblical narrative is given with the same intent as the epistles, to communicate truth about God, about us, so that we may respond. All right? That's true for narratives as much as it's true for an epistle. Now, the truth, how that truth is expressed is what's different. But that the intent in every book of the Bible, right? The intent is that we learn theological truth and respond to it. Prove to be doers of the word, not hearers only. And that doesn't just apply to epistles. That applies to every truth that's given to us in the Bible. Now, that takes us to, when it comes to narrative, actually, if you think about it, narratives make up, they're the most common genre in the Bible. And I've seen different numbers, but basically, if you just count up the words in the narrative books compared to the other books, narratives make up about 55% of the Old Testament. And a little more of the New Testament, 58%. So more than half of the Bible, of all the genres we have in the Bible, more than half is in the form of narrative. Historical narrative, by the way. That's significant, isn't it? So that epistles actually make up a very small part of the Bible as far as genre. Now, it's a very important part. Epistles are instruction for the church, so I am not saying they're unimportant. But what's interesting is when we think about the Bible, actually more than half the Bible is in the form of stories, historical events told in the form of stories. And again, the point in these is not just to give us the history. We don't have the book of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus just to tell us the history of Israel. We don't have the Gospels given just to tell us what Jesus said and did. All right? They're not just historical, they're historical theology. That is, the events in history are being expressed to us, given to us in order to teach us theological truths. And we're going to talk about this more as we go forward, but think about this. That's why you'll have, say, in the Gospels, you'll have the same story often in more than one gospel, right? In fact, like the feeding of the 5,000 is in all four Gospels. I think it's the only miracle that's in all four. Now, but when you read that account, there are differences in each of the Gospels. So, certain words or statements or actions that take place that one writer notes, but another one doesn't. All right. Now, they don't contradict each other, but what each author chooses to give us from what happened during the feeding of the 5,000, there are some differences. Why? Well, because each author wasn't just telling us those events so we go, oh, okay, now I know what happened in this story, that Jesus was given the fish and the bread and he prayed and it multiplied. Well, yes, that happened in the story, but each of those authors in the Gospels had potentially a different purpose in telling us that story. For example, in John's Gospel, he tells of what happened the next day. How, remember when the people came back to him and they were hungry again and they wanted Jesus to perform another miracle and multiply the food because they wanted to see a great miracle and they were hungry. And then Jesus says, look, you came out here for food, but there's a greater food that you need, a greater bread that you need. I am the bread of life. You need to eat me and drink my blood. Okay, that part is not in the other gospels, but John, he tells the story of the feeding of the 5,000 because he is setting up what happened on the next day when Jesus said that he was the bread of life. Now in Matthew's gospel, Matthew tells the story so that to show how Jesus is the Messiah, that he is able to do this great miracle, to show that he's the Messiah. In John's gospel, John had a different reason for telling us that story. He wanted to point to the truth that Jesus is the bread of life. And so he sets up that particular truth by telling us the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in order to introduce what happened the next day when Jesus was calling the people that you need more than physical food, you need spiritual food, you need me. Okay, so we see just in that one example that there could be different reasons that an author tells us a particular historical event. And we have to be careful that we don't just look at narratives in the Bible as the author just telling us history. Certainly that's part of it. But there's a purpose in telling that history. There's a theological truth that the author wants to communicate in telling us that history. And so he will choose particular events, particular statements, particular actions from the characters in order to communicate that biblical truth. And we'll see examples of that as we go forward in this module, where I'll point it out and I'll help you have the tools and how to approach studying a story. And you'll notice that certain things the author includes and certain things that he doesn't. I mean, think about in the book of Kings, for example. You may have some kings where there'll be chapter after chapter about that king. Other kings, maybe 3 verses. You have to ask, well, why is that? Why would the author tell us all about one king, but not another? Well, again, because there's a point and there's certain events that happen in one king's life that the author felt was important to tell us to communicate a particular biblical truth. He wasn't just telling us the history of the kings of Israel. There was a point to that narrative, and what the author drew out and the events that he described and the kings that he focused on. He did that because there was an overall point to the book of Kings that he wanted to communicate. All right. So again, as you study stories, you're not just studying the story to learn about some historical information that happened. You're studying the story to learn about what events are described here, what characters, what do they say and do, and what does that tell us about the point of the story? Because the point of the story is the theological truth that we're intended to learn and apply. All right, that's the idea. What is God saying here through the human author? What am I supposed to do in response to that? That's every passage in the Bible is, right? What is he saying and what do I do? All right. Okay. Thoughts about that? Pastor Philip, what is in your mind right now? What are you thinking? Anything you would add to that or comment, question?
No comment, but I have never thought as you mentioned, because yeah, the writer of the Bible, especially the historical. For example, King David's the writing is so long. Yeah, for some kings in Israel, very short. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have to think too, like even some of the kings may have had, like Manasseh, he reigned for 55 years. And yet all that was written about him was one chapter. Now, certainly in 55 years, a lot of things happened. But the author only chose to write about certain things, really with Manasseh, just a very few things that happened when he was king. He didn't write everything because it's not a history book. It's not chronicles of the history of the kings. It is certain things the kings said or did that all contribute to a point the author's trying to make in the book of Kings. Just like an epistle. You know, the author doesn't write every single possible thing about some particular point that he's making. He only focuses on certain things in order to communicate a particular truth that's connected to the background, the occasion, the reason that he's writing the letter. He has a specific purpose that he's trying to communicate in that letter. So he doesn't just write about everything he could write about. He's focused on a particular point. And it's the same with biblical narratives. I think we see that very clearly with parables, where Jesus would tell these short stories, not because he wanted to tell a story. Hey, disciples, I want to entertain you right now. I'm going to tell a story about a farmer. Well, no, that's not why he told parables. He told them because there was a purpose in each one of them, because of something that happened, something that was said. There's some point Jesus is wanting to make, and so he chooses to make that point in the form of a story. The Good Samaritan. You remember what prompted Jesus to give that story? Right? Remember, one of the scribes says, "Who is my neighbor?" So rather than Jesus just saying, "Well, your neighbor is," instead of just telling him directly, he chooses to give the scribe, the lawyer, a story. Now, why does he do that? We'll talk about that in a little bit. Why didn't he just tell him directly? Because sometimes Jesus would answer directly. Sometimes Jesus would answer by asking another question. But sometimes he would give a parable, a short story to communicate. But all the time it was meant to communicate a particular truth. I'm sorry, Pastor Philip, did you have anything else you were thinking?
No, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments or questions before we move forward? All right. I hope it makes sense. I hope it's clear. Let me have us consider a fourth. These are just sort of some thoughts regarding narratives, some general ideas. And here I want to ask a question, really related to, like I said, Jesus sometimes would answer a question or address an issue by telling a story. There are advantages to giving biblical truth in a form of a narrative, and there are also some challenges. And so I wanted us to think about this a little bit. What might be some advantages to expressing, communicating a biblical truth by using a story? as opposed to just saying it directly. What would be some advantages? Zhao Li, what do you think? What if you want to answer a question or communicate something, what would be an advantage of doing that by telling a story? Do you have any ideas?
It could be easier to understand.
Yeah, how? That's a good point. How would a story make something maybe easier to understand?
It's because it could be less complicated,
Okay.
and you can it actually might be the only one philosophy or something like that, not many of the
Okay.
idea.
So you can focus on one idea. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, good. A lot of times, right, for those of you who have children, sometimes it's easier to help them understand something by telling a story. All right, good. Anybody else have any, how about you, John Chang? What would be some advantages to using stories?
So that they can think.
Okay, can you expand on that? Like, what do you mean by that?
Because telling a story let them to really think about the situation. Just like because I'm a music teacher, and always I will say something, parables to describe something, and maybe it can make them remember something by remembering the story.
Yeah, stories actually, that's a good point. Stories can be easier to remember. All right, good. Very good. Anything else come to mind? Let's do this.
I think that's all.
Okay,
for me.
great, thank you. Fu Wei, do you have anything you would add to that? What maybe some advantages of telling, expressing a particular point in the form of a story rather than just stating the point directly?
Maybe about the story character is some kind related to the audience which are doing their work and even their positions.
Yeah, good. That was, I think, what was so powerful with Jesus's parables is he would tell them about an event in everyday life that the people could understand and relate to. You know, like when he talked about the Good Samaritan and the man coming up the road from Jericho, and they knew that that road had lots of robbers and was very dangerous. And so when Jesus is telling that story, his hearers could relate to that. Like, oh yeah, that's a dangerous road. And yeah, people get beat up and robbed there all the time. Wow, what if that was me? What if I was beat up? Boy, I would sure want someone to help me, right? So they could identify with that story. Anything else, Fu Wei, that comes to your mind? That's a good point.
Even some kind of their daily life, yeah, also related.
Like characters or daily life events. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, event activity, some kind related.
Yep. Okay, good. We can relate to those. You know, when Jesus would talk about farming, you know, and remember this parable of the sower and how some seed would fall on the hard soil, some on good soil, some on rocky soil. the people could identify with. They would understand that because that was part of their culture. And they would say, yeah, there is some seed that falls on the hard ground. So Jesus could use that story and connect it to certain truths that, and they would relate to it. And as John Shen said, they could remember it better then. Okay, good. Anybody else have anything that comes to their mind, advantages to using stories to communicate a particular point?
So how about easily captures the interest and ears of the listeners among older, young, and children alike?
Yes, that's a great point, right? Stories grab our attention. That's why we talked about when preaching, right? In your introduction, oftentimes it's very good to start with a story because people will be drawn in. They're very interested. We're just very interested. Oh, what's going to happen? What is this story about? So yeah, I think narratives, they effectively pull us into the story, get our attention. And maybe that's one reason why, more than half the Bible is narrative, because it's easier to remember, but also it draws us in, gets our attention, helps us to think about what if I was in that situation. Like I said, with the parable of the Good Samaritan, the hearers could identify with the man who was robbed. And so they could appreciate when Jesus talked about, the person who helped him. And when Jesus chooses to use a Samaritan to be that person that helped them, in that culture, they understood the Jews and Samaritans did not get along. And so Jesus was very intentional, and he used a cultural prejudice to emphasize the truth that he was saying, the importance of us being a good neighbor to others. Okay, good. These are some key advantages to consider. Again, narratives can be interesting. Again, as Pastor Philip said, people of all ages, children love stories, but so do older people. I mean, movies and books are so popular in our cultures all around the world. Why is that? Well, because people everywhere love stories. And so sometimes, right, especially those of you with children, realize that just telling them something, maybe that they may often just, not listen. But if you tell a story, that can draw their attention. And that's why as parents, it's so important to teach our children consistently all the stories in the Bible, because then when things happen in their lives, you can say, hey, do you remember the story about Abraham when he was, and then, oh yeah, I remember that story. Well, because they remember the story, you can more easily communicate something than just telling them directly. How often our kids, they tell us, don't lecture me, Dad, don't give me a sermon. But if I tell them a story, they're more likely to listen. So that's something to keep in mind. Narratives also are relatable. They are particular. Stories are just an excellent way to communicate biblical truth in a way that's memorable, interesting, captures our attention, those kind of things. But again, God did not make the whole Bible narrative. Okay. He also used poetry, sermons, epistles, prophetic books, but a good portion of the Bible is narrative. So I think God, understanding us and how he has made us, knows that giving truth in the form of stories is an effective way to teach us. All right. Okay. Let's just look at consider a couple of the other side of this. All right. These are some advantages. How about disadvantages? Maybe that's not the best way to say it. I think maybe a better word is challenges. What are some challenges that we would face with using stories to communicate biblical truth? All right, this one might be a little tougher to think about, but if a point is given in the form of a story, what might be some challenges to that? Does anybody have any thoughts or ideas about that?
Well, there's going to be big cultural challenges here as we live a few millenniums off from that. And boy, our lifestyle is nothing aside of what it was at that time. And so, when we were in India, it really brought the Bible alive, because there you're living right in that, I guess, Oriental culture with open wells and, I guess everything done by hand, no machines for the most part at all. And, ox carts and what have you, just goes on and on. I can remember going out in a field and actually walking behind an oxen with a plow just to get the experience, to see what that felt like. And of course, they sow just like it describes it in the Bible. And of course, there's a lot of artisans, that they were, like Jesus was a construction worker. He built homes, and so he would incorporate, but we just don't identify with that. So there's going to be some, I suppose, cultural things that really going to have to, and of course that's fun explaining that stuff, because there's so many parallels. And well, people just remember stories. You can go on and on about the wonders of propitiation and put them all to sleep. But if you mix it with stories and illustrations, it's rich, and of course so meaningful. I'm working with Isaiah right now, and that's a challenge. I haven't spent a lot of time in Isaiah, and I want to outline and put on PowerPoint Isaiah 53, but you got to go back and pick up all this about my servant. And there's a lot of background material before you get to 53 that gives of course, the full picture. So you're looking at a lot of work, a lot of time.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the idea that God has given me a little longer life to study. When Singapore, we did, we were busy doing everything but studying. I mean, the administration is overwhelming. And then, on Monday and Tuesday, you're just putting everything back together. They destroyed over the weekend, keeping things working. And then, of course, all the else that goes with it. But yes, the stories, they've got to be studied. Anyway, all these things are absolutely fundamental, and timeless truths are hidden in these beautiful tales of the scripture.
Yeah, that's really important point, probably, for us as interpreters, one of the most significant is the cultural challenges that you mentioned, and that we, just as with any passage, but especially with stories, we may presume certain things or assume certain things just from our own experience rather than understanding it from the perspective of the original author and audience. For example, in Ruth, right? When Ruth goes to Boaz at night, and in order to basically ask him to marry her in so many words. And I've heard many misinterpret that as she was making sexual advances to him and trying to sleep with him. Because people that don't understand the culture and what was happening there will often misinterpret certain events that take place. And sometimes that can be a serious error. And I think if you study the book of Ruth as a whole and understand all that was going on in that story, you would realize that she wasn't there trying to have sex with him. She was there in order to, draw his attention to consider marriage and taking her in along with her mother-in-law. And so we just have to be careful. I think Dwayne brings up a very good point that as we study these stories, really helps us to understand the culture. And, that's one of the challenges for us in interpreting the story is making sure we don't misunderstand or misinterpret things that are being expressed or told within the story. So that's a really helpful, important point, and exposes one of the big challenges in interpreting the stories. And that could lead us to sometimes in telling a story, often the author will not directly, the author rarely says, this is the point of my story. Okay. You rarely have that statement given in narratives, right? So often I should say, the meaning of a narrative can sometimes be difficult to identify. And by meaning of the narrative, what I'm saying there is the author's main point. The moral of the story can sometimes be difficult to identify. All right. And I would say, and we'll talk about this next time, narratives to me are probably the most abused genre in Scripture, where preachers often just take a story and they just import what they want the story to mean. I mean, I've heard this time and again, right? David and Goliath, right? How does God want you to face the Goliaths in your life? The giant problems that exist in your life. How does God want you to fight them? What are the 5 stones that you need in order to defeat the enemies of your life? David picked up the stone of faith and the stone of hope and the stone of courage and the stone of boldness and the stone of love. And he killed the giant. And they go into this whole elaborate, their own story, using the story of the Bible just to communicate their point, not the point of the author. It drives me crazy. And, I've done it too. I mean, all of us have, or they just take an event or a story in the Bible and then put in their message, the preacher's message in that event, rather than the author's message in that event. This happens all the time. And we need to be careful ourselves not to do that. So it's just as with any passage of Scripture that's taken out of context or misapplied or misunderstood. Boy, stories, I think, are probably, the word, or often this is what happens. Stories are moralized, meaning someone will tell the story of a biblical character and they'll make their sermon all about following the example of that character or not following the example of that character, depending on if it's good or bad. But you have to first ask yourself, was that the author's point? Was he telling us the story about this character because he wants that character to be an example or not? Or is there something else going on? For example, I'll bring this up next week. Potiphar's wife and Joseph. Is that whole story about how to deal with temptation? Is that why Moses gave us that story? Or how to deal with injustice in your life? Or is there another reason for that story? Certainly we can learn from Joseph's example, but was that what the author intended us to understand from that story? Or was the author showing us something else? We're going to actually later on, I think, go through that story together as an example. And I think there'll be some things from that story that perhaps you hadn't thought about or realized in what Moses was trying to communicate to us. But so often we just take a story like David and Goliath and just, okay, just use it as an example of what we should do. Well, that may not be the reason the author gave us that story. So we have to be careful that we don't misapply or misunderstand what the story is meant to tell us. Now, again, certainly we can learn from the example of characters of people all through the Bible. But we first need to understand, okay, what is it the author wants me to see in this story? What is the purpose of, why did the author of Samuel include David and Goliath? What was it about that event that the author felt was important for the point he was trying to make in the whole book? That's the other thing we're going to talk about is so often we take stories and pull them out of their context and disconnect the story from the book. But you can't do that. The story that's given is part of that book. So David and Goliath, that story isn't just about David fighting a giant. There's a connection of that story to the purpose of the whole book. And we have to be able to find what that connection is before you can accurately understand that story. Otherwise, you can pull out lots of things just from your own mind and then give a sermon on that. But we don't want to do that. We first want to know, okay, what is the author trying to tell us here in this story? So we will go into all of those things in the coming weeks. And I think we'll all learn there's so much more. I think studying and preaching biblical narratives is not easy. On the one side, stories are wonderful because they're easy to remember. It's easy, as you guys have said, communicate truths. But when we study biblical narrative, I think it's difficult because we first need to identify what is the author trying to say here. That's not always easy to do. And as Dwayne mentioned, right, even some of the cultural issues and there's just many hurdles that we need to overcome by the help of the Spirit, by diligent study, to find the point of the biblical narrative. So my goal is in the next several weeks and even months together is to help us be able to do that. How do we find the author's intended meaning? And then how do we communicate that accurately and clearly so that God's people will be blessed? All right. So I think now would be a good place just to pause, and we'll pick it up next week. I want to talk about a couple of other challenges that come out of using narrative and things we need to consider, and then we'll continue on and begin to talk about then what is the process for studying narratives. All right. Anybody have any final thoughts, questions, or comments before we end this evening?
I have one. I think sometimes it's a little bit cautioned for the younger age. For example, my daughter asked me why God used serpent to persuade Eve, because she is a girl. She wasn't really happy about Eve. So
Yeah,
I thought it's a little bit caution to the younger age.
yeah. Yeah, and there are certain stories, you know, like even in Genesis, when we were reading through the Bible to our kids, there's some pretty R-rated stories that talk about, you know, incest and, you know, sexual immorality and violence, some things that for our young kids, you have to be careful. Also, when you go through those stories, homosexuality, you know, when we were reading Genesis, I think our kids were 4 or 5 years old. And so we had to be careful sometimes and how much detail we would explain. So there's wisdom there. But if you understand the overall point of the story, then, you know, sometimes you don't have to give all the details yet for them to understand the point. But yeah, thank you, Zali. That's a good thing to remember. Anybody else? Final thoughts before we complete our time tonight? I think narratives are fun. And, you know, it's like, I don't know with you guys, but, you know, if you go through a story and then you discover the point of a story, and like, oh, and it's so amazing and it sticks with you. And I think that's what, if we really understand how to study and communicate biblical narratives, they're really powerful, powerful tool for the Lord to use in our lives to help us understanding biblical truth. Because when you see it in a story, it's very, very impactful. So I'm excited for this module. I think we'll learn a lot, and I think it'll really help us in how we preach biblical narratives. And by the way, if you're a preacher for any length of time, you're going to be, you know, talking about biblical, you're going to be preaching on biblical narratives. I mean, all, you know, the Gospels and Acts, you know, 60% of the New Testament is narrative, actually. So it's not just epistles. You can't stay in the epistles for your whole life, right? God gave us more than the epistles. They're very important, and I think they should be a focus for our preaching, because they are letters written for believers, for churches. But you can't, you know, God did not just give us epistles. He gave us a lot more. So we must be, and we must teach not only what the letters in the Bible say, but also from the other books as well. As Paul said, even, he taught the whole counsel of God. And by the way, when Paul preached, there weren't any epistles for many of the years. You know, there weren't epistles until 20 years after Jesus ascended. So for the most part, preachers were preaching from, not from epistles. That's something that came, you know, later in the early church. Again, I'm not minimizing epistles or saying that they're not important. I think they're extremely important for the church, but some preachers, that's all they preach on. And I don't think that's healthy in the long term for God's people. Okay. Well, thank you. It's good to see you, brothers. And I'm going to ask Pastor Philip, could